When an engagement ends, everyone expects a reaction. Crying, anger, loss of control, long explanations. I gave none of that. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, but because in that specific moment, I understood something that had been forming for a long time. That decision wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was confirmation that, for months, I was no longer included in the plans. He spoke like someone delivering a report, without pause, without prolonged eye contact, as if he were closing a meeting that had already gone on too long. He said he needed to think about his own life, that the moment was confusing, that maybe the engagement had been rushed. I listened to everything in silence, not from shock, from clarity. While he spoke, I mentally reviewed each interrupted conversation, each decision made without me. Each time I adjusted expectations to avoid conflict. It hadn't started there. It only ended there. For a long time, I thought being understanding was the same as being mature. I thought understanding the other person meant diminishing myself. I thought loving someone included accepting that certain parts of life would be decided without my presence. At the beginning of the engagement, he said he admired my calm way, that I was practical, that I didn't create drama. I took that as a compliment. Over time, I realized that not creating drama also meant not questioning, not asking for details, not taking up too much space. I was included in the easy parts, celebrations, vague plans, conversations about a future that never had a defined date. The real decisions came ready-made: where to live, when to wait, what was priority. There was always a later that justified my absence in the now. I told myself it was just a phase, that he was overwhelmed, that after the wedding, things would balance out. But the wedding never came close enough to be real. The engagement continued, but the feeling was of always being on the margins of something that was supposedly mine too. I wasn't consulted. I was informed. I wasn't invited to decide. I was invited to agree, and I agreed. Not from fear of losing, but from believing that giving in was temporary, that soon there would be reciprocity, that he would notice. He didn't notice, or he noticed and thought I wouldn't do anything about it. When he ended the engagement, there was no discussion, no attempt at persuasion, no impactful phrase. There was silence. And in that silence, something inside me organized itself. I didn't ask for extra explanations. I didn't try to negotiate more time. I didn't ask if there was someone else. Because, for the first time, the question that mattered wasn't about him. It was about me. At what point did I accept not being an active part of my own life? While he talked about uncertainties, I felt a clear certainty forming. I wasn't confused. I was tired of waiting for someone who always arrived late to the decisions that mattered. He ended it believing it would unstructure me, that I would remain stuck, that I would take time to react. Perhaps because, until then, I had reacted little. What he didn't see was that the silence wasn't absence of feeling. It was presence of consciousness. I said nothing because there was nothing more to be explained. Everything that needed to be understood had already been lived. When he left, the house became strangely quiet. Not empty, quiet. And for the first time in a long time, that silence didn't pressure me. It gave me space. I still hadn't made any move, still hadn't made practical decisions, still didn't have new plans. But something essential had already changed. I was no longer waiting. The first sign didn't come in the form of a fight. It came like almost everything between us, too discreet to seem important. We were sitting at the table, talking about moving. It wasn't yet a closed decision, but one of those topics that starts to take shape when an engagement progresses. I talked about neighborhoods, distances, routine. Nothing definitive, just possibilities. He listened to me for a few seconds, nodding his head like someone following a conversation whose ending they already know. Then, he said, "I've already thought about that. I think it's better to decide later." It wasn't the later that bothered me. It was the "I've already thought about that." It sounded like a period placed before I even finished my sentence. as if that reflection had already happened without me, and what I was saying now was just a delayed echo. I stayed silent for a moment. I waited for him to continue, for him to ask what I thought, for him to open space. Nothing. He changed the subject, picked up his phone, commented on something about work. The conversation died there, without conflict, without apparent tension. I smiled. I always smiled. That night, lying in bed, the scene came back to my mind, not as pain, but as discomfort. A feeling hard to explain, similar to when you enter a place and realize you weren't expected. I started noticing these small, invisible cuts after that. The decisions he communicated as facts. The plans that came already organized. The choices made thinking of our good, but without consulting me. There was always a logical justification. There was always a reasonable argument, and I always had enough maturity to understand, or at least to accept. When I disagreed, he reacted with excessive lightness. A short smile, a quick comment, like someone trying to soften something that shouldn't have been questioned. You worry too much about details. That's not that important. Trust me. Trusting, in that context, came to mean backing down. I didn't raise my voice, didn't make accusations, didn't demand long explanations, but I started to feel that gradually my opinions were being treated as accessories, not essential, something that could be considered but wasn't determinant. The curious thing is that he didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he noticed, but interpreted my silence as agreement, as approval. At a dinner with friends, someone commented about the wedding, talked about dates, about the party, about expectations. He responded with confidence, as if everything was under control. I heard versions of plans that hadn't been discussed with me. I smiled again, corrected nothing, waited for the right moment that never came. On the way back, I commented lightly, "I didn't know we had already decided that." He laughed. "They're just ideas. You take everything too seriously." That stayed with me, not because it was offensive, but because it was revealing. My questions were being seen as exaggeration, my participation as detail, my presence as something guaranteed. It was there that I realized something uncomfortable. He was too comfortable with the certainty that I would remain, that I would adapt, that I would understand. I was predictable to him, and predictability in a relationship is often confused with security, but it can also turn into carelessness. I started observing more than speaking, not by strategy, by instinct. I began paying attention to how he reacted when I expressed an opinion, to how long it took him to change the subject, to how certain decisions simply didn't reach me. And gradually, I understood. That wasn't explicit lack of love. It was something more subtle. It was the certainty that I wouldn't leave. He believed I was there, firm, understanding, available, that I wouldn't make noise, that I wouldn't question to the point of breaking. That was his first mistake. Not because I was planning to leave, but because, in that moment, something started to move inside me. I still didn't have a name for it. It wasn't revolt. It wasn't open hurt. It was lucidity, a silent perception that I was being placed in second place, and that this had become too normal. I said nothing, but I started seeing everything. The exact moment he underestimated me wasn't when he decided to end the engagement. That was just the final effect. The underestimation happened before, in a moment too simple to seem decisive. It was in an ordinary conversation, one of those that arises in the middle of routine when nothing seems to be at stake. We were talking about changes, not big ones, not definitive. Adjustments, possible paths, things that theoretically a couple about to get married should discuss together. I expressed a doubt, not as a demand, not as confrontation, just a sincere doubt. He listened with partial attention, his eyes alternating between me and his phone screen. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said with an almost didactic tone, "You're overthinking. You don't need to worry about that now." There was no rudeness, no irritation, but there was something worse. Certainty. The certainty that he was right, and that I was just reacting emotionally. I asked if we could decide together later. He answered that he already had everything more or less resolved. Once again, without me, I could have insisted, could have asked how that had been resolved, could have asked to participate. I did none of that. I observed the naturalness with which he assumed I would accept. I observed how he spoke as if he were reassuring me, when in reality he was pushing me away from the decision. I observed how my silence seemed to confirm everything he believed about me. He believed I hadn't noticed, that I didn't understand the dynamic, that I wouldn't have the courage to change anything. To him, I was too stable to break, too understanding to confront, too predictable to surprise. And maybe I had been that way until then. That day, something shifted inside me. It wasn't an explosion, it was a fine adjustment. An invisible line being redrawn. I started to understand that it wasn't about that specific topic. It was about the pattern, about how many times I had been gently pushed out of the center of decisions, about how many times I had confused calm with absence of voice. He continued talking, explaining why that choice made sense. He used logical, practical, irrefutable arguments. Everything seemed very well thought out, except for one detail: I wasn't included. And he didn't even seem to consider that a problem. When the conversation ended, he got up as if everything was resolved. He gave a quick kiss on my forehead, said I would understand with time. "You always understand," he said, smiling. There it was, the phrase that summarized everything. I always understood, I always gave in, I always stayed. He felt secure in that, secure enough not to notice the risk. That night, I didn't cry. Didn't call anyone, didn't write long messages that would never be sent. I just sat alone and let that clarity settle. It wasn't anger, it was something firmer. I realized he wasn't ending the engagement out of doubt. He was ending it because he believed I would remain stuck, that I would need time to recover, that I would orbit around the loss while he moved forward. He believed that ending would diminish me, and that was the biggest underestimation. Because in that instant, I didn't feel broken. I felt liberated. Liberated from trying to fit. Liberated from explaining the obvious. Liberated from waiting for someone who always arrived late to the decisions that mattered. I didn't announce anything. Didn't make an internal speech. Didn't promise grand new beginnings. I just understood. I understood that he didn't know who I was outside that silent version I had been sustaining. I understood that he confused my patience with weakness. I understood that he believed he was in control because he had never seen resistance. And I didn't correct that impression. I said nothing, because some turns don't need warning. After that day, I didn't change anything on the outside. The routine remained the same. The schedules, the messages, the already scheduled commitments. Anyone looking from outside wouldn't notice any difference, but inside, something had reorganized itself. I stopped explaining, stopped justifying my questions, stopped trying to find the right tone so as not to bother. Not because I was too hurt to speak, but because I finally understood that speaking wouldn't change the structure. It would only prolong the wear. He continued treating the end of the engagement as an event that would require adaptation time on my part. He commented with calculated care that I needed to give myself time, that I was sensitive, that these things weren't simple for me. I agreed with my head, without irony, without sarcasm, and in silence I mentally noted each wrong certainty he had about me. I observed how he calmed down when he noticed I wasn't reacting intensely. That confirmed everything he believed, that I would remain stuck, that I would take months to reorganize my life, that I would need him in some way. He didn't notice the most important detail. I wasn't quiet from fragility. I was quiet from clarity. It was during this period that something new happened, not a grand decision, not a detailed plan. It was simpler than that. I started acting without announcing. I fixed things that had been stuck for years, resolved pending issues that were always put off, reorganized schedules, reviewed priorities, not for revenge, for alignment. Each small action was a thread being pulled from inside out, a gradual return to a place I had occupied before learning to diminish myself to fit. And then came the moment when I needed to pause the story, because this is the point where many women recognize themselves. If you've ever been underestimated like this, or know someone who was, subscribe. Here, stories don't end small. I continued. There was no internal speech about starting over, no motivational phrases stuck on the refrigerator. There was practice. I started saying no to what I previously accepted out of exhaustion, started saying yes to things I postponed for others' convenience, started occupying spaces I myself had left empty. He still appeared from time to time, trying to maintain comfortable contact, short messages, neutral comments. Questions that seemed like concern, but carried curiosity about how long I would take to fall. I responded politely, without opening doors, without closing them forcefully, and that confused him, because he expected two options, drama or dependency. He wasn't prepared for tranquility. It was in that silent interval that something consolidated inside me. I didn't need to prove anything. Didn't need to be seen as strong, didn't need to impress anyone. I just needed to continue. The awakening wasn't a snap. It was a continuous adjustment. I understood that I had spent too much time waiting for validation from someone who never saw me as a central part of their own life, and that insisting on that would be repeating the mistake, just with awareness. When I realized it, I was already in another emotional place. Not distant from coldness, but from direction. I knew where I was stepping. He didn't. And that became evident in the undertones of conversations. In comments about how I seemed too well, in subtle attempts to maintain relevance, in the poorly disguised surprise at noticing I no longer orbited that absence. I didn't announce change, didn't write texts, didn't make scenes. I just continued. And by continuing, I stopped being predictable. The turn didn't happen on the day I did something visible. It happened on the day he realized something had already been done, without him knowing when. It was in a casual conversation, one of those that seem harmless. He sent a message asking how I was. There was no explicit longing. There was curiosity, a contained interest, almost technical, in understanding how I was dealing with all that. I answered that I was fine, without exaggeration, without justification. He took a while to respond. When he responded, he said that was good. He added that he imagined I was still processing things. That changes take time. There it became clear. He still saw me in the same place as before, stuck, adjusting feelings, trying to understand what happened. Meanwhile, I had already understood. He suggested we meet to talk calmly. Not to get back together, at least not in terms he would admit, but to close things well, to align feelings, to ensure there were no hard feelings. I accepted, not from hope, for closure. When we met, he seemed comfortable. He spoke with tranquility, like someone who believes they're conducting the situation. He commented that I seemed more centered, said that confirmed he had made the right decision at the right time. "You were always strong," he said, as if it were a final compliment. I listened in silence. He talked about his future, about undefined plans, about freedom, about how some things simply don't work when they're forced. He talked a lot. When he finished, he waited for my reaction. Maybe he expected contained tears, maybe an attempt at reconnection, maybe some phrase confirming he still occupied a central place. What he received was something very different. I thanked him for his honesty, said I understood, and added calmly that that conversation didn't change anything that was already decided. He frowned, asked me to explain. It was the first time I clearly noticed that the control was no longer with him. I explained that I was no longer waiting for clarity, that I didn't need late emotional alignment, that the end of the engagement had been the final point of something that was already unraveling. He tried to soften, said that maybe in the future things could be different, that life takes turns, that nobody knows tomorrow. I smiled, not from irony, from closure. I said the future was indeed unpredictable. and that because of that, I had decided to no longer live in suspension, not to build plans based on the absence of others' decisions. It was there that he realized. He realized I wasn't there to negotiate, that I didn't need time, that I wasn't waiting for a change of mind. He realized I had moved on, without announcement, without audience, without confrontation. The turn was this: he expected to be the point of reference. He discovered he had become just a concluded part. There was no argument, no dramatic apology, no desperate recovery attempt. There was silence. But this time, the silence wasn't mine. When we said goodbye, he seemed confused, not sad, not regretful, confused, like someone who realizes they lost something without understanding exactly when it happened. I left there with a strange feeling of lightness, not euphoria, not exaggerated relief, just alignment. I hadn't defeated anyone, hadn't proven anything, hadn't changed who I was. I had just stopped waiting, and that was enough to change everything. After that meeting, there were no more long conversations, no out-of-context messages, no attempts to keep something alive out of habit. The consequence didn't come in the form of his regret, it came in the form of my continuity. I continued, not in a spectacular way, not with changes too visible to those observing from outside. I continued in the hardest way, with constancy. Mornings started having a different weight, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer woke up expecting something that didn't depend on me. There was no more silent expectation occupying mental space. That by itself was already a form of freedom. I started noticing details that previously went unnoticed. How much I adjusted my time to someone else's rhythm. How much I postponed personal decisions, waiting for them to fit into a plan that was never fully mine. Without the engagement, there was no more forced fitting. There were simple choices, but whole ones. Some people asked how I was. Others avoided the subject. There were those who said I seemed too well for someone who had ended an engagement, as if there was a mandatory time of visible suffering, a script to be followed. I didn't follow it, not because I was cold, but because I had spent too much time suffering in silence before the official end. The morning, when it came, was almost already concluded. He appeared one last time, weeks later, not to talk, to confirm. He asked if I was sure everything was okay. Said he didn't want me to think he had been unfair. I listened attentively, responded politely, said I didn't think about it in terms of fairness or unfairness, that I thought about adequacy, and that it simply no longer served me. He seemed relieved and at the same time displaced, like someone who closes a story expecting a specific effect and finds a completely different one. Maybe he understood, maybe not, and that stopped being relevant. The real consequence wasn't what he felt, it was what I no longer felt. I didn't feel guilt for choosing myself, didn't feel the need to justify my tranquility, didn't feel the desire to explain why moving forward didn't mean forgetting, but respecting what had been lived. My life started moving forward, not because something new appeared immediately, but because something old stopped holding me back. I was no longer trapped in the version of me that needed to be accepted to exist in a relationship. I didn't need to prove maturity by swallowing discomfort. I didn't need to be understanding at my own expense. The final consequence was this: I returned to occupying the center of my own life. There was no applause, no public announcement, no external validation. There was coherence. I learned that some people only realize value when they no longer have access, and that this isn't a tragedy, it's a filter. Not everyone needs to understand your departure. Not every ending needs to be dramatic to be definitive. Some closures are silent, and precisely because of that, irreversible. I said nothing when I needed to, said everything when I chose to move forward, and life, finally, followed. Over time, people stopped asking, not because the story had been forgotten, but because there were no more visible signs of it in my life. I didn't talk about the engagement, didn't avoid the subject, just didn't carry it with me. Some stories don't need to be repeatedly explained to be overcome. They just need to be understood once. from the right side. I continued living, with new mistakes, with different choices, with a presence I didn't have before. I learned that not all pain asks for immediate reaction. Some ask for silence, not the silence of submission, but of internal listening, the one that reorganizes before acting. Today, looking back, I understand exactly where everything changed. It wasn't on the day of the breakup. It was on the day I stopped trying to be understood by someone who never wanted to listen. I didn't leave with anger, didn't leave slamming doors, didn't need strong phrases to justify my departure. I left whole. Whole because I understood that dignity isn't negotiable. Whole because I realized that love without space becomes containment. Whole because I stopped confusing calm with erasure. Some people only learn when they lose access. Others never learn. And that's okay. Not every lesson needs to be shared. The most important thing is recognizing when your life is stuck because you're waiting for someone to decide for you, and understanding that sometimes the hardest decision is simply to walk, without announcing, without warning, without asking permission. I said nothing when he thought I would stay, said nothing when he believed I wouldn't understand, said nothing when he thought I wouldn't have courage, because some answers aren't said, they're lived. And that's how my life started moving forward. Some people only realize value when they no longer have access. And sometimes that's exactly what frees the one who stayed. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Stories We Tell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep creating stories about strength, self-respect, and new beginnings, because stories that restore dignity deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for being here.